In this video, I'm going to take you through the step-by-step process of exactly how I build this off-grid micro camper that can be towed by almost any vehicle. I started by constructing a prefabricated trailer that I picked up at Northern Tool for about 600 bucks. I used lock nuts, washers, and Loctite to make sure these bolts don't rattle off over time, then made sure the trailer was nice and square before installing the leaf springs. I then bolted on the axle that can support up to 2,500 pounds. I next wanted to install some scissor jacks, so I cut down this piece of aluminum with my angle grinder, drilled some holes in it, then painted it black. Once it dried, I brought it over to the trailer frame so I can bolt it on, then installed my scissor jacks. Once there was one bolted onto each corner, my wife came over to help me flip this trailer over so I can install the wheels. I then used the scissor jacks to jack up the trailer frame nice and high before installing the spindle onto the axle. This trailer came with some tiny little wheels, so I upgraded them to some bigger ones, and it ran me about 400 bucks, but it was totally worth it because it's going to make the ground clearance a little higher and allow this camper to ride a lot smoother. The next day, I brought the trailer frame outside and used the wire brush to remove paint from all the corners so I can weld this thing together. And I'm not welding every piece of this trailer together, I'm just doing all four corners just to make sure this thing never falls apart. I used an angle grinder to smooth out some of the welds, then laid a few layers of Rust-Oleum spray paint just to make sure this thing stays nice and protected. I picked up these aluminum L brackets and bolted them onto the frame so I can install some corrugated plastic to give this camper the most protection possible from moisture and rain. I laid a bead of construction adhesive, then inserted the corrugated plastic onto the lips of the trailer frame and repeated the same process over and over until the entire trailer was covered. I then cut 3/4 inch grooves into a few pressure treated 2x4s, drilled some holes into them, and mounted them onto the trailer frame. Doing this will allow the camper walls to lay flush with the 2x4s, giving the camper a nice sleek look. I then ran the wires for the tail lights and added an extra 14 gauge wire just in case I want to add anything in the future. Then it was finally time to insulate the subfloor, so I cut a bunch of these foam boards down to fit into the trailer frame, then applied some expanding spray foam in between each layer, giving the subfloor of this camper an R value of 9, which isn't the same R value of a house, but this is a camper, so I figured what the heck, we're doing the best we can with what we have anyways, so let's just get it done. Once we finish insulating the subfloor, I picked up this 6mm clear plastic that will work as the vapor barrier, cut it to size, then stapled it onto the 2x4s we put onto the frame earlier. I then cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and mounted it directly on top of the vapor barrier. I drilled some holes to allow the plywood to lay flush onto the trailer frame because the bolts just stick out too much. To secure the subfloor onto the trailer frame, I pre-drilled some holes and used some 1¼ self-tapping screws and spaced them apart every 10 inches or so. Then just like that, the subfloor of this camper is completely finished. Now that the subfloor is complete, it's time to install the walls. So I carefully drew the shape of the camper onto a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, then cut it out. The jigsaw that I'm using is one of the first tools that I ever bought, and even though it's a cheaper Ryobi brand, this thing has seen a lot of projects and is still kicking, so maybe we should give him a name. I then put the piece that I just cut out on top of another piece of 3/4 inch plywood, clamped it down, traced it, then cut that piece out as well. We then made the measurements so we can pre-drill the holes for the framing. Spread a thick layer of Titebond 2 onto the grooves that we cut out earlier, then placed the wall onto the grooves that we just cut out and screwed it in. Repeated the same process on the other side, then measured and cut out some 2x2s that will work as the framing, then screwed them in every 10 inches across the entire top. Since a 4x8 sheet of plywood isn't long enough to cover the entire camper, we had to cut out another piece and screw it into the wall that we just put up using a 1x4. Then repeat the same process on the other side with the help of my good friend Tom. I then cut a piece of plywood that will work as the wall to separate the bed area from the kitchen area, drilled some pocket holes and installed it, making sure to leave at least 80 inches in the front part where the queen size mattress will go. Building these campers and making these DIY videos is like a therapy to me. Before I was a YouTuber, I suffered from anxiety and felt like I wanted to do something to help people, and making these DIY building videos does just that. Which brings me to today's sponsor, an online therapy company called BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who you can talk to through video chat, phone calls, or text. All you gotta do is visit betterhelp.com, answer a few questions about yourself, and BetterHelp will connect you with an experienced professional therapist in as little as 2 days. In this day and age, meeting with an in-person therapist can be really tricky, especially if you have a really busy schedule. So start today and visit betterhelp.com or click the link down in the description below. Now that the roof is framed out and the ceiling panels are up, it's time to frame out the inside of this camper. I cut a bunch of 2-inch slats out of a piece of plywood, traced out the wheel well, then installed them onto the wall. These slats will work as dividers for my insulation and as an anchoring point for my interior walls. I then cut out a bunch of pieces of insulation that will fit in between the slats, and used a little spray foam so it sticks to the wall properly. This foam insulation is awesome, but sucks if you get it on your skin. It took me like 3 days to fully get it off my fingers, so next time I think I'll use gloves. I next slid a piece of 1/4 inch plywood into place and traced out my door. Cut it out, then put it back into its spot because these will work as the interior walls. After installing my walls, I filled in all the screw holes with some quick setting wood filler, waited a few hours, then brought it outside so I can give it a good sanding so that I can go ahead and paint the interior walls. For the paint, I'm using a paint and primer beige color from Behr and adding 2 thick layers to make it look the best that I can. And while I finished painting, Hope started staining the slats that will go onto the ceiling. After letting everything sit for a few hours, it was officially time to install the ceiling slats, which will give this camper a really nice aesthetic when it's all finished up. We glued and nail gunned each piece to the ceiling while keeping them evenly spread out with this 1-inch spacer. Then just like that, the ceiling was up and it was time to install the lights. We're installing 6 of these 2.5-inch 12-volt puck lights, which are super easy to install. You just drill a hole and these spring-loaded levers hold them into place. Wiring them up is also pretty straightforward. You basically just wire up the negative to the negative and the positive to the positive. Run the wires to the battery and put an on and off switch in between the positives, and that's it. Once I finished wiring up my lights, I wanted to make sure they worked, so I connected them to a battery real quick. And this part always makes me feel like Einstein, except I'm not a genius. But the next step was to start building a platform that my batteries can sit on. But I first wanted to make it as waterproof as possible, so I mixed up some resin epoxy, spread it out with a squeegee, then laid my fiberglass mat on top of it and let it sit overnight. While the fiberglass dried, I figured it was a good time to install the flooring, so I gave the subfloor a really good vacuum. For the flooring, we're going with a company called Flooret because they send you a sample box to help you figure out which color fits best in your space, which makes things really convenient when you're building a project like this, so I'll link the sample box in the description below. We decided to glue each piece to the subfloor to make sure it doesn't shift around while you're driving and stays put. And we didn't add an underlayment because this floor already comes with one built in, so there's really no need. This was really easy to do and only took me about an hour. Then just like that, the entire floor of this camper was complete. Now that the panel that we fiberglassed earlier is nice and dry, it was time to sand it and paint it so we can go ahead and install it onto the camper. And it's steps like this that I'm taking to make these campers as high quality as possible, because I'm planning on selling this camper and I want the person who buys it to go back and look at this video knowing they bought a camper that was built right. I drilled holes into the base of this battery box so I can connect it to the frame. I next pre-drilled a bunch of holes so I can install the front wall. The front wall of this camper is also made out of 3/4 inch plywood because a bunch of the battery components are going to be screwed onto it and I want it to be as heavy duty as possible. After the front wall was installed, I painted the top of the battery box with some more of this exterior paint and primer just to make sure it lasts as long as possible. Once the paint dried, it was finally time to install the battery system. So I started by placing two 200 amp hour lithium batteries from Litime on the platform that we just built. I screwed on my positive bus bar and my negative bus bar where all the components will meet to keep things nice and organized. I added fuses and an on and off switch that will go in between the batteries and the bus bar. And I'm only tightening everything by hand because I'm going to come after and make sure everything's torqued down properly. I drilled some holes so I can run some wires behind the wall to keep things as organized as possible, and started by connecting my 3000 watt pure sine wave inverter to the positive bus bar. And for the negative, I installed the battery monitor shunt in between the negative bus bar and the negative side of the battery, then ran a wire from the inverter to the negative bus bar. Then basically repeated that process with the 12-volt fuse panel and the solar controller. I used this crimper tool to make sure all my battery cables were crimped down properly, connected the negative and positive of my batteries together, then finished installing the rest of the 2x2 framing so I can run all of my wires through. The rest of the components in this camper, like the lights, max air fan, and water pump, are all going to be connected to this 12-volt fuse panel, so I stripped the wires and crimped on these ring terminals, gave them a little tug to make sure they're crimped properly, then connected them onto the 12-volt fuse panel. I then ran the wire through the ceiling and into the max air fan hole, and just like that, our first component was wired up. I then repeated the same process with the rest of the lights, water pump, and refrigerator, and I also ran the solar wires through the same holes so I can connect them to the Litime solar controller. I crimped ferrules onto the solar wires before installing them onto the controller. I'm gonna link all the tools and electrical products that I used throughout this whole build in the description below. I then installed my temperature sensor and finished running the wires to my pure sine wave inverter. And if you notice, I'm only using Litime products in this build because they're much more affordable and offer the same quality as some of the more expensive brands, and I've been using them for years, so I'll link them in the description below. But then it was time to test the lights to make sure they worked, and just like that, our electrical system was all finished up. Now that the electrical system is complete, it's time to insulate the roof of this camper. I had an extra bag of this Havelock wool insulation laying around from my last build, so I figured let's just use it. And this stuff is made out of 100% wool and has a much better R value than the foam insulation we used for the subfloor, so I think it's going to work out really well for this camper. After installing the insulation, I hammered on these metal wire protectors onto the studs to make sure I don't screw into any of the wires. Then it was time to install the roof, so I cut out a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, put it on top of the roof, and screwed it in. I then grabbed my trusty jigsaw and cut out the hole for the max air fan. And speaking of jigsaw, I read on his label that he was made in Mexico, and since he's really reliable, I figured we can call him Hector, but we'll talk more about that later in the video. I drilled a 3/4 inch hole so I can run all of my electrical wires through the wall, then added some more insulation onto the front slanted part of this camper. And for the people who are interested in building a camper like this, I made detailed step-by-step plans of exactly how to build the shell of this camper, so I'm going to link that in the description below. We finished off the rest of the Havelock wool insulation on the interior wall. Then finished it off with a 1/4 inch panel and came back around and filled in all the screw holes with some quick setting wood filler. After painting the interior wall, it was time to build some cabinets. So I ripped down a few pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, then used my iron to glue down a bunch of edge band onto all the exposed plywood edges. Then painted each individual piece before putting the cabinets together. I had some leftover paint from my previous project, so I figured let's just paint the cabinets with that. Plus, this stuff's like $70 a gallon, so might as well just use it up. Once the cabinets were put together, I brought them into the camper and screwed them into the studs. This cabinet will have the control panel built into it, so I started off by running all the wires through the holes that I made in the face earlier. Then connected the solar controller, all of the light switches, and at the bottom there's going to be a 110 volt outlet that will have USB and USB-C outlets built into it. I then connected the on and off switch for the inverter to the inside of the cabinet, installed the cabinet door, then repeated the same process on the other side. There's also going to be a TV in between these cabinets, so I made a wooden TV mount that's slanted and installed the TV onto the TV mount. But the next step was to start building the battery box, so I ripped out a bunch of pieces of 3/4 inch plywood and pocket holed them directly onto the body of this camper to make sure they're as structural as possible. To help this electrical system stay cool, I decided to add a fan on both sides of this battery box, one sucking air in and the other blowing air out. I'm not sure how cool it'll keep this electrical system, but it definitely won't hurt. To allow easy access to this electrical system, I decided to install this 30-inch door. So I traced it out onto a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and cut it out with Mr. Hector. Then made sure the door fit into the hole and went ahead and installed it onto the battery box. Once I finished building the battery box, it was time to build the cabinets for the backside of this camper. These cabinets are going to be simple, so I basically repeated the same process from the cabinets earlier in the video, except these cabinets are not going to have any doors and have this flexible netting instead, which you guys will see in the end of this video. After we finished hanging the cabinets, I painted the subfloor with this exterior paint to try to preserve it as long as possible. I then started building the cabinets so I could install the water system. This camper will have a 6-gallon freshwater tank and a 6-gallon gray water tank. I next installed the small water filter that will go in between the freshwater tank and the water pump. And for the plumbing, we're using PEX because it's more flexible and doesn't crack as easy when the temperature changes. And it's also super easy to install. You basically just cut the pieces to size, then use this crimper thing, and that's it. I then connected the PEX to my water pump and wired it up. I also installed this PVC pipe that comes out the bottom of the camper, which lets you know your water tank is full and won't let you overflow it. And the next step was to install our fridge that we picked up from Bougie RV. It'll sit right above the freshwater tank, so I had to make a mount for it to sit on. We chose this fridge because we can wire it directly to our 12-volt batteries. It pulls only 36 watts when it's on eco mode, which makes it perfect if you're doing off-grid camping. It also works as a fridge or a freezer, and the temperature can go as low as 7 degrees and up to 50 degrees. I then brought them out into the camper, screwed it in, and installed the fridge. My favorite part is that this fridge is compact, super lightweight, and really affordable, which makes it perfect for a small camper like this. It also has a USB port so you can charge your phone, and a sleek paint job on the lid. So if you're planning on buying a fridge for your camper, check out Bougie RV. I'm going to link them in the description below. After installing the fridge, it was time to install the gray water tank. I used PVC cement to glue on this 3-inch pipe, slid it through the floor of the camper, then glued on an elbow. I'll come back later in the video and install the rest of it. But the next step was to cap off the bottom part of the kitchen, then build a drawer that will go in between the fridge and the sink. After finishing up the drawer, it was time to install the countertop. So I cut out the hole for the sink and the fridge, then sanded the crap out of it so I can stain it. After installing the countertop, I went ahead and installed the faucet and the sink. I then screwed on the piano hinge for the fridge door, and just like that, the countertop of this camper was installed. I next screwed on the framing for the back door of the camper, then installed some more of the slatted ceiling from earlier in the video on this back portion. This gives the back portion of this camper a nice aesthetic, and we ended up drilling 2-inch holes so we can install more puck lights. So when you're back here and camping, you'll have plenty of lighting so you can cook some food or just chill. But the next step was to mix some epoxy and add some sawdust so we can make a wood filler that has the consistency of like peanut butter. We then put it in a bag, cut the tip, and squeezed a little bit onto every single screw hole because this stuff's gonna harden up like a rock and ensure this thing's not gonna leak. After letting it set overnight, we sanded the crap out of the entire camper with 150 grit sandpaper. We sanded the camper the best that we can, and even Tom came over to help because the next step is gonna be fiberglass. In order to get the fiberglass mat to stick to the camper properly, we had to roll on a thick layer of epoxy resin and let it sit for about 20 minutes. Once the epoxy was tacky, we cut a sheet of fiberglass and stuck it onto the camper. We used a foam roller and a squeegee to get out as many air bubbles as possible, then roll down another layer of resin epoxy. Tom here, he came over to help us fiberglass. We then repeated the same process over and over to try to get this camper fiberglass because it was supposed to rain the next day. It took us just under 11 hours to finish fiberglassing this camper, and we wanted to let it cure for 2 days, so while it dried, we decided to start building the doors. We used the door cutout from earlier in the video and traced the window onto it. Cut it out and made sure the window will fit, then did the same thing with a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, but we just made it a little bit bigger. I then used some Titebond 2 to glue the 2 pieces together and screwed about 30 screws into it. I explained on how to build these doors in more detail in the plans that we made. I'll link them in the description below. But I next cut out the hole for the door latch, made sure it would fit, then took it apart so I can fill all the screw holes. To fill the holes, I'm using Bondo glass, which is a body filler that has fiberglass built into it. What's nice about this stuff is that it gets as hard as a rock and it's sandable within 15 minutes, which is perfect for when you want to get projects done quickly. But I will say this stuff smells like hell, so if you use it, wear a mask. After sanding the crap out of the doors, I wiped them down with a damp rag so I can fiberglass them. And I basically repeated the same fiberglassing process from earlier in the video, then let them sit overnight. Once the side doors were done, it was time to make the frame for the back door. And I'm using this aluminum corner trim that the back door will rest on, and also will have a gasket on it so this door doesn't leak. I pre-drilled some holes into it, then used some silicone sealant and put in a screw every 10 inches or so. Once all the corner trim was done, it was time to build the back door. The back door is going to be made out of 1/4 inch plywood, some framing, and 1 inch insulation. After putting the back door together, I brought it to the back side of the camper and installed it to make sure it'll open and close properly before I fiberglass it. I'm using these marine grade stainless steel hinges for the back door because I don't have all this fancy machinery to make these complicated hinges that hide inside of the camper, and it just worked really well for a cheap price. But I then went ahead and filled all the screw holes, sanded the crap out of it, installed the door latch, and fiberglassed the door, then let it sit overnight. It was officially 2 days since we fiberglassed the camper, so it was time to give it a good sanding. We used 80 grit sandpaper to try to make the fiberglass as flat as possible because we're going to be rhino lining this thing. And rhino liner requires a really rough surface in order for it to bond properly. And after sanding the entire surface of this camper, we masked it off, made sure it was dust free, then mixed together some of this tintable Raptor liner. And for the color, we chose desert sand. I shook the crap out of it for a few minutes, then it was officially time to paint this thing. As soon as I finished painting, I immediately took the masking tape off, then went ahead and finished painting the doors. And just like that, the entire camper was Raptor lined, and holy crap, this thing was coming out so amazing. But once it dried, I got straight to it and started installing the doors. I added some silicone, then installed the door for the battery box, screwed it in, then added another bead of silicone around the entire edge just to ensure this thing doesn't leak. It was then time to put the side doors together so we can install them onto the camper. I added some more silicone around the window, screwed it in, then installed the door latch. Then painted the inside trim of the doors, and while they dried, I went ahead and finished some of the painting on the camper. And I didn't Raptor line the bottom side of this camper because I wanted to add a nice black trim around it, which gives the camper a nice finished look. Once I finished painting the bottom trim, I went ahead and installed the back door. Then installed the valve for the gray water dump tank. And at this point, things were starting to come together so quickly, I was able to install all the doors in just one day. For the side doors, I had to make these little spacers so I can install a gasket, which fit perfectly onto a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, allowing these doors to be watertight. But I next installed my exterior lights, drilled a hole for my freshwater tank, installed the inlet, hooked it up, then made sure there was no leaks, and just like that, my water system was all set. But the next step was to install the max air fan. So I added a bead of roofing grade adhesive, installed the bracket, screwed it in, then put my max air fan into place. I then went into the camper, wired it up, installed the trim cover, and just like that, the max air fan was installed. It was then time to install the taillights, so we hooked up the taillight bracket, wired them up, made sure they worked, then went to the back side of the camper and installed struts onto the back door. For some of the last touches, we installed a 200-watt solar panel, laid a bead of roofing grade adhesive onto all the brackets, put the panel in place, then screwed it in. We finished off the back side of the camper by installing some of the finish panels, then installed a tri-folding queen-size mattress which takes about an hour to expand out, hooked up the camper to the tow hitch, and just like that, the entire micro camper was all finished up. This camper is 8 feet long by 5 feet wide and took us a little over 4 weeks to build. It cost us just under $12,000 to complete and will be posted for sale. It took over 1,000 individual clips to put this video together, and I only say that because we're working as hard as we can to make the best possible videos for everyone. So with that being said, click subscribe.